Chapter 3, Part 1 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marsatich, Alexandria, Virginia, June 2009. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 3, A Jaguar Hunt on the Taquary, Part 1. The morning after our arrival at Corumba, I asked Colonel Rondon to inspect our outfit, for his experience of what is necessary in tropical travelling has been gained through a quarter of a century of arduous exploration in the wilderness. It was Fiala who had assembled our food tents, cooking utensils, and supplies of all kinds, and he and Sig, during their stay in Corumba, had been putting everything in shape for our start. Colonel Rondon, at the end of his inspection, said he had nothing whatever to suggest, that it was extraordinary that Fiala, without personal knowledge of the tropics, could have gathered the things most necessary, with the minimum of bulk and maximum of usefulness. Miller had made a special study of the piranhas, which swarmed at one of the camps he and Cherrie had made in the Chaco. So numerous were they that the members of the party had to be exceedingly careful in dipping up water. Miller did not find that they were cannibals toward their own kind. They were cannibals only in the sense of eating the flesh of men. When dead piranhas, even when mortally injured piranhas, with the blood flowing, were thrown among the ravenous living, they were left unmolested. Moreover, it was Miller's experience, the direct contrary of which we had been told, that splashing and a commotion in the water attracted the piranhas, whereas they rarely attacked anything that was motionless, unless it was bloody. Dead birds and mammals, thrown whole and unskinned into the water, were permitted to float off unmolested, whereas the skinned carcass of a good-sized monkey was at once seized, pulled under the water, and completely devoured by the blood-crazy fish. A man who had dropped something of value waded in after it to above the knees, but went very slowly and quietly, avoiding every possibility of disturbance, and not venturing to put his hands in the water. But nobody could bathe, and even the slightest disturbance in the water, such as that made by scrubbing the hands vigorously with soap, immediately attracted the attention of the savage little creatures, who darted to the place, evidently hoping to find some animal in difficulties. Once, while Miller and some Indians were attempting to launch a boat, and were making a great commotion in the water, a piranha attacked a naked Indian who belonged to the party, and mutilated him as he struggled and splashed, waist deep in the stream. Men not making a splashing and struggling are rarely attacked, but if one is attacked by any chance, the blood in the water maddens the piranhas, and they assail the man with frightful ferocity. At Corumba the weather was hot. In the patio of the comfortable little hotel we heard the cicadas, but I did not hear the extraordinary screaming whistle of the locomotive cicada, which I had heard in the gardens of the house in which I stayed at Asuncion. This was as remarkable a sound as any animal sound to which I have listened, except only the batrachian-like wailing of the tree hyrax in East Africa. And like the East African mammal, this South American insect has a voice, or rather utters a sound which, so far as it resembles any other animal sound, at the beginning remotely suggests batrachian affinities. The locomotive whistle part of the utterance, however, resembles nothing so much as a small steam siren. When first heard, it seems impossible that it can be produced by an insect. On December 17, Colonel Rondon and several members of our party started on a shallow river steamer for the ranch of Senor de Barros, Las Palmeiras, on the Rio Taquary. We went down the Paraguay for a few miles, and then up the Taquary. It was a beautiful trip. The shallow river, we were aground several times, wound through a vast marshy plain, with occasional spots of higher land on which trees grew. There were many water birds. Darters swarmed. but the conspicuous and attractive bird was a stately jabiru stork. Flocks of these storks whitened the marshes and lined the river banks. They were not shy, for such big birds. Before flying they had to run a few paces, and then launch themselves on the air. Once, at noon, a couple soared round overhead in wide rings, rising higher and higher. On another occasion, late in the day, a flock passed by, gleaming white with black points in the long afternoon lights, and with them were spoonbills, showing rosy among their snowy companions. Caimans, always called jacares, swarmed, and we killed scores of the noxious creatures. They were singularly indifferent to our approach and to the sound of the shots. Sometimes they ran into the water erect on their legs, looking like miniatures of the monsters of the prime. One showed by its behavior how little an ordinary shot pains or affects these dull-nerved, cold-blooded creatures. As it lay on a sandbank, it was hit with a long .22 bullet. It slid into the water, but found itself in the midst of a school of fish. It at once forgot everything except its greedy appetite, and began catching the fish. It seized fish after fish, holding its head above water as soon as its jaws had closed on a fish, and a second bullet killed it. Some of the crocodiles, when shot, performed most extraordinary antics. Our weapons, by the way, were good, except Miller's shotgun. The outfit furnished by the American Museum was excellent, except in guns and cartridges. This gun was so bad that Miller had to use Fiala's gun, or else my Fox 12 bore. In the late afternoon we secured a more interesting creature than the jacares. Kermit had charge of 2 hounds, which we owed to the courtesy of one of our Argentine friends. They were biggish, nondescript animals, obviously good fighters, and they speedily developed the utmost affection for all the members of the expedition, but especially for Kermit, who took care of them. One we named Shenzi, the name given the wild bush natives by the Swahili, the semi-civilized African porters. He was good-natured, rough, and stupid, hence his name. The other was called by a native name, Trigueiro. The chance now came to try them. We were steaming between long stretches of coarse grass about 3 feet high, when we spied from the deck a black object, very conspicuous against the vivid green. It was a giant anteater, or tamandua bandera, one of the most extraordinary creatures of the latter-day world. It is about the size of a rather small black bear. It has a very long, narrow, toothless snout. With a tongue it can project a couple of feet. It is covered with coarse black hair, save for a couple of white stripes. It has a long bushy tail and very powerful claws on its 4 feet. It walks on the sides of its 4 feet, with these claws curved in under the foot. The claws are used in digging out anthills, but the beast has courage, and in a grapple is a rather unpleasant enemy, in spite of its toothless mouth, for it can strike a formidable blow with these claws. It sometimes hugs a foe, gripping him tight, but its ordinary method of defending itself is to strike with its long, stout, curved claws, which, driven by its muscular forearm, can rip open man or beast. Several of our companions had had dogs killed by these anteaters, and we came across one man with a very ugly scar down his back, where he had been hit by one, which charged him when he came up to kill it at close quarters. As soon as we saw the giant tamandua, we pushed off in a rowboat, and landed only a couple of 100 yards distant from our clumsy quarry. The tamandua, throughout most of its habitat, rarely leaves the forest, and it is a helpless animal in the open plain. The 2 dogs ran ahead, followed by Colonel Rondon and Kermit, with me behind carrying the rifle. In a minute or two the hounds overtook the cantering, shuffling creature, and promptly began a fight with it. The combatants were so mixed up that I had to wait another minute or so before I could fire without risk of hitting a dog. We carried our prize back to the bank and hoisted it aboard the steamer. The sun was just about to set, behind dim mountains many miles distant across the marsh. Soon afterwards we reached one of the outstations of the huge ranch we were about to visit, and hauled up alongside the bank for the night. There was a landing place, and sheds and corrals. Several of the peons or gauchos had come to meet us. After dark they kindled fires, and sat beside them singing songs in a strange minor key and strumming guitars. The red firelight flickered over their wild figures as they squatted away from the blaze, where the light and the shadow met. It was still and hot. There were mosquitoes, of course, and other insects of all kinds swarmed round every light, but the steamboat was comfortable, and we passed a pleasant night. At sunrise we were off for the fazenda, the ranch of M. de Barros. The baggage went in an ox cart, which had to make 2 trips, so that all of my belongings reached the ranch a day later than I did. We rode small, tough ranch horses. The distance was some 20 miles. The whole country was marsh, varied by stretches of higher ground, and, although these stretches rose only 3 or 4 feet above the marsh, they were covered with thick jungle, largely palmetto scrub, or else with open palm forest. For 3 or 4 miles we splashed through the marsh, now and then crossing boggy pools where the little horses labored hard not to mire down. Our dusky guide was clad in a shirt, trousers, and fringed leather apron, and wore spurs on his bare feet. He had a rope for a bridle, and 2 or 3 toes of each foot were thrust into little iron stirrups. The pools in the marsh were drying. They were filled with fish, most of them dead or dying, and the birds had gathered to the banquet. The most notable dinner guests were the great Jaguar storks. The stately creatures dotted the marsh, but ibis and herons abounded. The former uttered queer, querulous cries when they discovered our presence. The spurred lapwings were as noisy as they always were. The ibis and plover did not pay any heed to the fish, but the black carrion vultures feasted on them in the mud. And in the pools that were not dry, small alligators, the jacare tinga, were feasting also. In many places the stench from the dead fish was unpleasant. Then for miles we rode through a beautiful open forest of tall, slender caranda palms, with other trees scattered among them. Green parakeets with black heads chattered as they flew. Noisy green and red parrots climbed among the palms, and huge macaws, some entirely blue, others almost entirely red, screamed loudly as they perched in the trees, or took wing at our approach. If one was wounded, its cries kept its companions circling around overhead. The naturalists found the bird fauna totally different from that which they had been collecting in the hill country near Corumba, 70 or 80 miles distant, and birds swarmed, both species and individuals. South America has the most extensive and most varied avifauna of all the continents. On the other hand, its mammalian fauna, although very interesting, is rather poor in number of species and individuals, and in the size of the beasts. It possesses more mammals that are unique and distinctive in type than does any other continent save Australia, and they are of higher and much more varied types than in Australia. But there is nothing approaching the majesty, beauty, and swarming mass of the great mammalian life of Africa, and, in a less degree, of tropical Asia. Indeed, it does not even approach the similar mammalian life of North America and northern Eurasia, poor though this is compared with the seething vitality of tropical life in the Old World. During a geologically recent period, a period extending into that which saw man spread over the world in a substantially the physical and cultural stage of many existing savages, South America possessed a varied and striking fauna of enormous beasts, saber-toothed tigers, huge lions, mastodons, horses of many kinds, camel-like pachyderms, giant ground sloths, mylodons the size of the rhinoceros, and many, many other strange and wonderful creatures. For some cause, concerning the nature of which we cannot at present even hazard a guess, this vast and giant fauna vanished completely. The tremendous catastrophe, the duration of which is unknown, not being consummated until within a few thousand or a few score thousand years. When the white man reached South America, he found the same weak and impoverished mammalian fauna that exists practically unchanged today. Elsewhere civilized man has been even more destructive than his very destructive uncivilized brothers of the magnificent mammalian life of the wilderness. For ages he has been rooting out the higher forms of beast life in Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and in our own day has repeated the feat, on a very large scale, in the rest of Africa and North America. But in South America, although he is in places responsible for the wanton slaughter of the most interesting and the largest, or the most beautiful birds, his advent has meant a positive enrichment of the wild mammalian fauna. None of the native grass-eating mammals, the graminivores, approach in size and beauty the herds of wild or half-wild cattle and horses, or so add to the interest of the landscape. There is every reason why the good people of South America should waken, as we of North America, very late in the day, are beginning to waken, and as the peoples of Northern Europe, not Southern Europe, have already partially wakened, to the duty of preserving from impoverishment and extinction the wild life which is an asset of such interest and value in our several lands. But the case against civilized man in this matter is gruesomely heavy anyhow, when the plain truth is told, and is harmed by exaggeration. After 5 or 6 hours traveling through this country of marsh and of palm forest, we reached the ranch for which we were heading. In the neighborhood of giant fig trees, singly or in groups, with dense, dark green foliage. Ponds, overgrown with water plants, lay about. Wet meadow and drier pasture land, open or dotted with palms and varied with tree jungle, stretched for many miles on every hand. There are some 30,000 head of cattle on the ranch, besides herds of horses and droves of swine, and a few flocks of sheep and goats. The home buildings of the ranch stood in a quadrangle, surrounded by a fence or low stockade. One end of the quadrangle was formed by the ranch house itself, 1 story high, with whitewashed walls and red-tiled roof. Inside, the rooms were bare, with clean whitewashed walls and palm-trunk rafters. There were solid wooden shutters on the unglazed windows. We slept in hammocks or in cots, and we feasted royally on delicious native Brazilian dishes. On another side of the quadrangle stood another long, low, white building with a red-tiled roof. This held the kitchen and the living rooms of the upper-grade peons, the headmen, the cook, and jaguar hunters, with their families. Dark-skinned men, their wives showing varied strains of white, Indian, and negro blood. The children tumbled merrily in the dust, and were fondly tended by their mothers. Opposite the kitchen stood a row of buildings, some whitewashed daub and wattle, with tin roofs, others of erect palm logs with palm-leaf thatch. These were the saddle-room, storehouse, chicken-house, and stable. The chicken-house was allotted to Kermit and Miller for the preparation of the specimens, and there they worked industriously. With a big skin, like that of the giant anteater, they had to squat on the ground, while the ducklings and wee chickens scuffled not only round the skin but all over it, grabbing the shreds and scraps of meat and catching flies. The fourth end of the quadrangle was formed by a corral and a big wooden scaffolding, on which hung hides and strips of drying meat. Extraordinary to relate, there were no mosquitoes at the ranch. Why I cannot say, as they ought to swarm in these vast pantanals, or swamps. Therefore, in spite of the heat, it was very pleasant. Near by stood other buildings, sheds, and thatched huts of palm logs in which the ordinary peons lived, and big corrals. In the quadrangle were flamboyant trees, with their masses of brilliant red flowers and delicately cut, vivid green foliage. Noisy oven birds haunted these trees. In a high palm in the garden, a family of green parakeets had taken up their abode and were preparing to build nests. They chattered incessantly, both when they flew and when they sat or crawled among the branches. Ibis and plover, crying and wailing, passed intermittently overhead. Jacanas frequented the ponds near by. The peons, with a familiarity which to us seems sacrilegious, but to them was entirely inoffensive and matter of course, called them the Jesus Christ birds, because they walked on the water. There was a wealth of strange bird life in the neighborhood. There were large papyrus marshes, the papyrus not being a fifth, perhaps not a tenth, as high as in Africa. In these swamps were many blackbirds. Some uttered notes that reminded me of our own redwings. Others, with crimson heads and necks and thighs, fairly blazed. Often a dozen sat together on a swaying papyrus stem, which their weight bent over. There were all kinds of extraordinary birds' nests in the trees. There is still need for the work of the collector in South America, but I believe that already, so far as birds are concerned, there is infinitely more need for the work of the careful observer, who to the power of appreciation and observation leads the power of vivid, truthful, and interesting narration, which means, as scientists no less than historians should note, that training in the writing of good English is indispensable to any learned man who expects to make his learning count for what it ought to count in the effect of his fellow men. The outdoor naturalist, the faunal naturalist, who devotes himself primarily to a study of the habits and of the life histories of birds, beasts, fish, and reptiles, and who can portray truthfully and vividly what he has seen, could do work of more usefulness than any mere collector in this upper Paraguay country. The work of the collector is indispensable, but it is only a small part of the work that ought to be done, and after collecting has reached a certain point, the work of the field observer, with the gift for recording what he has seen, becomes of far more importance. End of chapter 3, part 1.